Good evening, everyone. I'd like to call the West Hartford Virtual Community Planning Economic Development Committee meeting to order. Today is Tuesday, April 5th, 2022. The time is about 6 p.m. For the record, please note that the committee members are all present, including myself, Councilman Winograd, Councilman Zdanowitz, and also let the record reflect that Councilman Cortez has joined us as well. So we have done item number one. Item number two is the minutes of the meeting of February 16th and March 28th. Is there a motion to receive?
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
Moved and seconded. All those in favor of accepting the minutes as submitted, say aye.
Aye.
Okay, the minutes are accepted. Let the record reflect that Mayor Cantor has also joined us for here. Okay, so we're going to move on to the other remaining item on the agenda, which is 2B, an ordinance regulating adult use cannabis and smoking in the parks, which was the advertised title. I'll turn it over to Mr. Ledwith, and then you can designate which staff members you wish to participate here, and then we'll get into committee discussion of this item. Thank you, Mr. Ledwith.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Rick Ledwith, Acting Town Manager, and thanks to everyone for being able to join us for this special community planning and economic development meeting to continue our discussion on an ordinance regulating adult use cannabis. During our last meeting, we spent time discussing the distances between a cannabis retailer and special sites like schools, parks, libraries. The council asked us to look at adding municipal buildings to this list, as well as looking at 500-foot distances and 1,500-foot distances between retailers and these special sites. I believe at the time there was a concern that a location could open up right across the street where Dunkin' Donuts is located across from Town Hall. So before we get into the analysis, I do want to point out that there is a limit in the number of retailers and micro cultivators we could have under RACA, and that is based on population, and that is 1 per 25,000 residents. So that would actually limit us to 2 retailers and 2 micro cultivators throughout town. I think in our last meeting, we had mentioned 3 retailers because of our understanding that you would actually round up with that formula. So this is a correction. We are in fact limited to 2 retailers and 2 micro cultivators town-wide until June 30th of 2024. So at this point, Jerida, if you could bring up the first map, I'd appreciate it. All right, and hopefully folks can at least have seen this beforehand and can squint their eyes a little bit and see what is on this map. So this map highlights the differences between 500 and, yeah, that's perfect, thank you, and 1,500 feet with municipal buildings included. So 500-foot buffer yields approximately 348 potential sites. And on the right-hand side, you can see a 1,500-foot buffer yields approximately 20 potential sites. So obviously much more restrictive at 1,500 feet. Right, if you could scroll through to the second map. Thank you. So this map highlights the differences between 500 and 1,500 feet with municipal buildings and childcare centers removed from the calculation. And the reason we move both of these is because with the sheer number of municipal buildings, particularly our fire stations that are located primarily in commercial zones throughout town, so including municipal buildings would place more restrictions on the ordinance. And as we looked at childcare facilities, we do have, believe it or not, we have approximately 50 childcare facilities located throughout town as well. So that creates further restrictions with the ordinance, particularly on Park Road and Prospect Avenue, where we have 70 commercial sites that would be impacted by including childcare centers on that special site list. So removing those as special sites would result with a 500-foot buffer would result in 486 sites. And then at 1,500 feet, we would have 154 potential sites. And you will notice that the site across the street at Dunkin' Donuts from Town Hall would not be a permitted use for a cannabis retailer because of its proximity to the library. So at 500 feet, that site would not be an option for a retail establishment. So if, Dred, if you could do me a favor and just go to the last map here, third map, thank you. So in addition to looking at the distances between cannabis sites and special sites, we were also tasked with creating a buffer between cannabis sites so that we didn't see a concentration of retailers in one section of town. And if you recall from last week, we did discuss 1,000 feet, we considered 2,500 feet, 3/4 of a mile, et cetera. So during one of our staff meetings, we discussed internally the possibility of looking at limiting retail locations to business districts only. So instead of commercial districts, like we discussed last week, we could limit it to business districts only. And if you look on our third map here, we assume 500 feet buffer to a 500-foot buffer to special sites, excluding municipal buildings and childcare centers. And on the left, we have commercial sites, commercial districts on the left. And then on the right-hand side, we have business districts on the right-hand side. So you can see if we limit it to just the business districts on the right-hand side, we do create a natural buffer. On the lower section, you can see Elmwood. And then through the center of town, you can see that natural buffer that occurs in the center of town as well. So that's a consideration for the council to consider. So we could look at just limiting it to the business district and not the commercial district. We could also consider adding additional distances within that business district as well, as if the council wanted to consider that. So we did present an ordinance that considers the business district with a 500-foot buffer. And then we did exclude municipal buildings and childcare centers from that draft ordinance that we included in the agenda as well. So why don't I just stop there for a moment before we get too deep into the ordinance and see if there's any clarifying questions that any of the council members have. Did those three maps make sense to everybody?
Mr. Winograd?
Thank you, Mr. David. If you just clarify what type of, beyond the ones listed, what other commercial, what is that excluding of commercial? Or those designations?
Through you, Mr. Chairman, I'll turn that over to Mr. Demay, our town planner.
Mr. Demay.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Through you to Mr. Winograd. Councilor Winograd, the other excluded zones are primarily all of our 4 industrial zones. So currently in the industrial zones, retail uses are an as of right use in those industrial zones. So excluding those from that calculation yields that last map that Manager Rick just described to the council. The other thing to point out there is the flip side of that, the rest of the cannabis establishments, so the non-retail dispensary or hybrid uses, would be limited only to the industrial district because they are.
Mr. Demay, you got frozen there. So you were saying the production facilities would be limited to the industrial zone. So I think what you were going to say that they would be limited to the IE, IG, IP, and IR zones, correct?
That's correct, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Winograd?
Thank you. I understand. No, I have no other questions.
Are there any other questions of the the two slides, the three slides that were presented by the acting town manager. I thought they were pretty self-explanatory, and I would like to thank staff for doing them quite rapidly to accommodate this meeting. And then I would also like to commend Corporation Council for taking a look at the maps and seeing what could possibly be done, and offering the changes with respect to the ordinance regulating the adult use of cannabis. So what we have before us this evening, and with respect to the ordinance, nothing really changed until we get to section 177-16.10. And the major change was that cannabis establishments shall be permitted subject to the following conditions. One condition was no cannabis establishment shall be permitted on a site that is within 500 feet of any school, municipal park, or municipal or recreational facility or library. Said distance shall be measured by taking the narrow straight line between the respective lot boundaries of said sites. The cannabis retail establishment, including retail or hybrid retailer or dispensary, shall be restricted to the BN, BND, BS, BG, BC, CB, DH, BG zones. And as I just recently mentioned, the production facilities would be in the IE, IG, IP, and RIR zones. And then the establishment could not be permitted unless a site plan approval has been obtained in accordance with section 177.42B. And this would require meeting the compliance of what's necessary with the town planner, who would make certain that all state laws and regulations concerning cannabis establishments were met. So that's what we have before us with respect to the ordinance regulating adult use cannabis. We're not talking about what we had at the last meeting, the third page, which dealt with prohibited acts. We've basically taken that off the table at this point. So what we are proposing to move forward is what I basically just outlined. And I'd also like to let the record reflect that Councilwoman Blanks has joined us as well. Good evening, Councilor. I don't know if anyone has any questions about the ordinance that's being proposed, or any suggestions or amendments at this particular time. Mr. Zanowitz.
Thank you. So I think the spirit of our last meeting was, and things have changed since then, 3 versus 2 establishments as far as retail. And I think the spirit of the meeting was to spread those out and see if we can have as much distance as we can, keeping away them from municipal buildings, i.e. the town hall and such. And I understand that the library takes care of that. But in light of that, and then looking at these maps, and they're very difficult to see on an iPad, I don't know if, but I think the distances, I would actually look at still including town hall as a piece outside of the library. You know, I understand the firehouses being across town, but maybe would like to see town hall still included in that, because with only 2 anyway, and then the distance is 500 versus 1500, and we looked at a lot of things, quarter mile. So I would actually propose going maybe something in between the 5 and the 1500 feet, and still including town hall in this ordinance going forward. That's all.
Thank you, Mr. Zdanowitz. Is there a discussion about Mr. Zdanowitz's suggestion? Mr. Winograd.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I don't see the specialness of town hall in particular. I mean, it almost feels like, you know, I mean, it's sort of our, you know, workplace and our town employees' workplace, but beyond that, I mean, and obviously people come, but it sort of feels like well, we don't want it in our neighborhood, but we'll put it in somebody else's. It feels like the town sort of taking a kind of a NIMBY attitude toward our own building, and not necessarily sort of other interests. It just I don't quite see the rationale for town hall in particular. Libraries make sense. I mean, I suppose, and obviously schools, but I mean, I think one factor in all this is just, especially with only having two places, we don't know how difficult it will be to find an actual location. And my understanding is that retailers prefer pretty strongly to own the building, which I think excludes a lot of other areas anyway. I'm not going to buy a piece of Blueback. They're not going to buy. You're not going to buy, some other buildings that are standalone. So I wonder about sort of the whether or not we're giving enough sort of areas to do it. There is a demand, and to some extent, let's see how the market plays out, and let people try to open a business, and make their best sort of estimates as to where the most profitable place to open it will be. So as between the two versions, I appreciate all the work. I can kind of go either way as to this proposed one or what we kind of had originally. I think the discussion has been helpful in sort of limiting the issue of talking about having $1,000 feet or bigger. I mean, this works. Frankly, I think the 1,000 probably works as well. But I think either one is going to be acceptable to me. But at this point, I don't think we want to make things too hard on potential business owners.
Thank you, Mr. Winograd. Are there other members of the committee or other councilors who wish to offer an opinion or comment? Seeing none, I would concur that the situation has changed significantly since our last discussion. There's 33% less opportunities to own an establishment now that we only have two cannabis retailers. And what I think was really interesting was when we look at the different slides that show the number of permitted parcels where this activity could take place. I think by being in business districts only, the number I believe was 259 parcels. And I think that's a reasonable amount of parcels as drafted. So I was really concentrating on how many parcels would be eligible for this particular activity. I do believe that the market will dictate where somebody decides to make a sizable investment in their business opportunity to be successful. And I think what we learned from the distance factor was that if we made it too restrictive, we would have very few sites available for this activity. And I don't think we're trying to adopt an ordinance with the purpose to ban this economic activity. So if that's not our goal, and our goal is to regulate the activity, then I think we have to offer what I think are reasonable standards with respect to the regulation of the location. And I think from a legal standpoint, so that we aren't challenged in court saying that our regulation is too restrictive. That could be a problem if we're basically making it such that this activity, even though it's allowed per state statute, but we basically crafted it where it can't exist at all, would be a problem. And we would have a very difficult time defending that position. So I'm of the opinion that I think as drafted this evening provides us with reasonable, thoughtful alternative, thoughtful discussion as to how we reach this conclusion. And I think that's all going to be very important with respect to the legislative history, should we face a legal challenge from somebody who wanted to locate in a particular location. So I'm trying to be a little bit forward thinking and also be realistic with respect to where this economic activity is located. I do appreciate Mr. Zdanowicz's remarks with respect to the town hall. But I do think in the end, we will be served quite well with the way that it's currently written. With that said, is there anyone else that would like to say something or offer any other commentary? Mayor Cantor.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I also want to thank staff for doing this. I know this is not an easy thing to do, so I appreciate the combination of maps. I just want to make sure that I got to this, was able to read this a little late, so it was kind of a scramble. But I just want to make sure. So what's proposed by input from the last meeting and staff looking at this is the 500 buffer. It's the last map we saw. It's the one that allows the BNBND be at all of the business districts, but not commercial districts, the 500 buffer, allowing 259 potential sites as of now. Is that correct?
No, Madam Mayor, that is how I read it. If we want to get confirmation from a Corp Counsel, Ms. Verano.
Sorry, Mary Cantor, I wasn't following that one. You're gonna have to repeat that question. For
I'm
me.
just confirming that the scenario that is before us, the ordinance that we are it will be coming out of committee to council, is a little bit different than we had been looking at before. It allows for the dispensaries only to be in the business district as opposed to commercial district, and allows, according to the town maps that were just presented to us or presented on as background information, 259 potential eligible zoned areas as of now.
Correct.
Okay. All right. I would also agree with, yeah, no, I think this actually is a good way to look at it, and I think this does, as Mr. Davidoff said, makes sense. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor Cantor. Is there anything for Mr. Zdanowic?
Thanks. I'm just curious real quick, Mr. Davidoff, what legislation are you worried about us getting sued at, given the parameters that we're given to establish these zones? So what piece of law are you talking about getting sued over potentially?
Thank you for the question. So I think whenever you have a zoning regulation, if the regulation is too narrow in scope, okay, that you're basically prohibiting the activity, even though you say that you're not prohibiting the activity, I think that's where I am concerned that the entire ordinance could be struck down. And should that be the case, I really don't wish to have any court of competent jurisdiction to substitute its will for the will of our particular body with respect to our local zoning code.
Okay, so just for the record, this is just speculation and opinion. There's nothing that you can cite that says that we can't zone a specific buffer by how many differentiating feet. We're allowed 2 in town, 2 retail versions, then there's no specific legislation that says that we can't have a zoning ordinance between here and there. And if our town allows and zoning allows for 2, then it's not out of compliance with any specific law. I'm just looking at the specific law versus opinion.
Mr. Zdanowic, I think that if we make the parameters too narrow, we could end up not having sites available, is how I read it, sites available for this economic activity. And there are other zoning regulations that we have established in our community and in others, where they have been found to basically, the intent has been to basically ban the activity without specifically saying that you're banning the activity. So that is my concern. And I think what we're trying to address this evening is what is a reasonable distance between the uses that currently exist and what we're allowing this new activity, which is an unknown at this point, to locate somewhere. So in several years, this entire discussion could be moot, and this could be something that could be as prevalent as stores that sell wine and alcoholic beverages. So, those are pretty well regulated by the state as well as by the town with respect to distances as well. So, this ordinance will get us through June of 2024. Will give us ample time to revisit should the situation warrant, and should the number of licenses granted to our community increase. So I think that this is, I think, a prudent starting place. Mr. Cortez.
Through you, Chairman. Looking at the various maps, if we went the most restrictive route with the maps, it still gives plenty of opportunities. I don't feel like we're limiting too much. I understand the cautiousness, but it's still gonna allow us to, right? It doesn't change that number. And I forget how many retail space was available, but it's not like we're making it much more difficult. It's just a lot less retail space still throughout the town. And my understanding, this is where we have public hearings also. So to go through committee, then public hearing, and if there is concerns with people that might be interested in this business, and they feel it's too restrictive, that's something we could look at. Or again, it gives plenty of opportunities, and down the road we can always have look at how we do things. We change zoning all the time. So I don't see there being a negative, and I understand about being cautious, but I think that we're given plenty of opportunity if we went with the most restricted map that we presented today. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Cortez. Just to respond briefly, this would not necessitate a public hearing for the location of the particular use if it is allowed in these particular zones and the applicant meets that criteria, and the applicant can demonstrate to the town planner that they have met the state and local regulations. The planner can do nothing but to approve the operation of the facility in that particular location. Mr. Winograd.
Just to about Mr. Cortez's last point. If you look, it does, obviously the 1500 buffer does knock down to 150 or even 20 potential sites. But the bigger problem is that if you look at these maps, particularly when we get to the 1500, we start putting the only allowed places in Elmwood, or practically we're really pushing it all to the southern part of town, which was a problem with the current ordinance on medical, and there was, I think, quite a bit of upset from Elmwood saying, "Wait a minute, why are you putting it in our neighborhood?" And I think that actually, whether true or not, because I think it was aimed at the industrial areas, it legitimately created, I think, some concern that that part of town, was being dumped on. And I think to the extent we can avoid that sort of controversy is to the better. And again, I don't think that was before my time. I don't think that was the intent of that particular ordinance, but it did have that, sort of reaction to it. So I do think that having as broad a geographic area where it's possible to put a store is the fairer way to go.
Thank you, Mr. Winograd. Mr. Cortez.
And I just want to say thank you for pointing that out. Like I said, I just saw all these maps now and trying to make sense out of where everything is at, because that is my fear too. I don't want to push it all on one corner of town, because it's, that's always my fear, that we'll just put load Elmwood up with these types of businesses and limit the growth in there. So thank you for pointing that out.
Thank you, Mr. Cortez. And I think it's important to note that the I zones are located in our south end of town as well, because the rest of our town is basically either a commercial zone or residential zones. And there's really no other lots now that would really be available for an industrial zone anywhere else in town. So if we put all the dispensaries in the same zone as the I zones, okay, or but the I zones, then they're all going to be located in the south end of the community. And I don't think that's what the intent of our of this body is. I think what we really are trying to do is take a measured look to provide equal economic opportunities, a variety of site locations to prospective investors who are willing to engage in this particular economic activity. And I think if we get to be too restrictive, I think then we really haven't accomplished what is really necessary for us to accomplish. And I'll just leave it there. Is there anything further from any other members? Ms. Blanks.
Thank you, Chair. So since I came to the meeting late, I apologize, but I would just like to concur, because I'm an Elmwood resident and that is a big concern. And as I look at the map, I do see this green, very little green on one side of the map and a lot of green on the other side. And the other side happens to be my community as well. So thank you for being able to express what you just said, because the outcome really is important at the end of the day. And we do want to represent our community and make sure that we have their interest at heart as we're making these decisions. So I just want to voice that.
Thank you. Thank you, Councilor Blanks. Is there any further discussion? Seeing none, I'll just ask the members of the committee, are we ready to move this forward? Mr. Manager.
Sorry, Mr. Chairman, Rick Ledwith, Acting Town Manager. I just wanted to, at the risk of confusing things, and that's not my intention. So I have been guilty of referring to dispensaries as my consideration of what ultimately will happen in town is we'll have prospective retailers looking to open establishments. And I will frequently use the word dispensaries, but those are retailers and dispensaries are two different things. So we are limited to 2 retailers in town, but there is no limit to dispensaries or hybrid retailers. I just wanted to point that out. So, I mean, we've always, I've considered retailers essentially what we'd be looking at coming into town, but dispensaries, and my team has corrected me a million times because I will refer to dispensaries. And my thought, a dispensary is a retailer, but they are 2 different things. So not to create any confusion, but just so the folks understand that clarification.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Winograd.
Yeah, and I'll go too far. I'll make the motion to adopt this, but also just similar to Rick, just to avoid confusion. And I don't know whether we're the only one seeing this or whether this got published on the agenda. I noticed that on the agenda we have the attachment referenced adult use of cannabis. And of course, this is not adult use of cannabis ordinance. It is the ordinance itself is properly identified as adult use cannabis regulation, so which is the appropriate term. but the of got put in there, and I don't want to set up some newspaper article that talks about or to confuse anybody about what the purpose of this, and it's not about use. It's just about the retail itself. But with that, I'll move the issue.
Thank you. Is there a second? I'll second. Okay. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Anyone opposed?
Yeah.
Okay, the motion carries 2-1. We'll be sending it on to the entire council to be placed on the agenda of the council to schedule for a public hearing. I'd also like to thank all town staff for the amount of time that they've worked on this to get us to where we are this evening. I have no other further items on the agenda. Since this is a special meeting, I believe that we're probably limited to what we can discuss, Mr. Manager and Corporation Counsel. So with that, I'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye. We stand adjourned. Thank you, everyone. We'll see you tomorrow night for a budget meeting.
Thank you.